Hey everyone and welcome back to a new video. So like many of you, I've had a couple of weeks to pore over the new Warhammer 40k 9th edition rulebook, and I have to say I think it's certainly one of the best ones that Games Workshop have produced in the last few editions, not least because of the incredible artwork that is presented throughout. Just glancing at some of these images, you can see that 40k's grimdark aesthetic is as prominent as ever, and it's also wonderful to see how generous the design team has been with that artwork. It makes the initial 191 pages an absolute joy to flick through again and again. But more than this, I really appreciate how they've found that balance between lore and hobby. Each of its faction sections go into the detail of its various armies and characters, and then shows those models in action on the tabletop. For us veteran players, this will certainly be welcome, but I think it's hard to overstate the effect this will have on new players too. For me personally, my spark for Warhammer 40k came from seeing the armies arrayed on the tabletop and imagining what my first army could look like. The fact that Games Workshop has taken the time to fuel that spark in others is just a really great thing to see. Now in truth, there's so much about this rulebook and 9th edition in general that I want to talk about in future videos. This includes the intriguing bits of lore we find dotted throughout and how Games Workshop is presenting the hobby to new and existing players. But in this video I want to kick that broad discussion off by talking about Warzone Armageddon, a double page section of the rulebook that has sparked a lot of interest in the community for a number of reasons. Now, as a very quick recap, Armageddon is actually the Orc homeworld Ullanor, made famous as the planet where Horus broke the back of the Orcish Empire and earned the title of Warmaster. Now, you would expect a world like that would be well known in the Imperium, but 1500 years after the events of the Horus Heresy, the Orc race resurged during the War of the Beast, and the events of that conflict eventually saw the Mechanicum secretly teleport Ullanor to the Armageddon system, where it has remained ever since. During the preceding millennia, Armageddon has become a hotspot for conflict, with the Orc warlord Ghazghkull Maguruk Thraka attempting on 2 occasions to recapture the world and bring the Imperium to heel. However, thanks to the bravery of its citizens and an Imperial war effort second only to Cadia itself, the warlord has been forced to abandon his plans and seek conquest elsewhere. However, before Ghazghkull arrived on Armageddon, the planet was also the location for another world-ending conflict, that being when the traitor Primarch of the World Eaters and Demon Prince of Khorne, Angron, arrived, largely by accident actually, and proceeded to go on a bit of a rampage. It was only the efforts and sacrifices of the Grey Knight's Third Brotherhood that finally put an end to Angron's fury, but traces of his presence and that of Chaos lingered on the planet. The Imperium could not afford knowledge of Angron's existence in the war to get out, so they rounded up the entire planet's population, sterilised them and sent them to work in camps for the rest of their lives, all while a new population, entirely unaware of Armageddon's history, were resettled in their place. Now, despite this rather colourful backstory, Armageddon has had a rather low-key role in the more recent editions of 40k. Outside of the many Black Library books, its last major tabletop appearance goes back to the 3rd edition Codex supplement, and it's only really been used since as the setting for a few of the side games such as Epic and Shadow War. So you can imagine everyone's surprise when, almost out of nowhere, it suddenly gets a double page spread in the 9th edition rulebook, along with some rather intriguing references, specifically to Angron and his title, the Red Angel. So in this video I could speculate about Angron and the launch of new Khorne units, and I will touch on those in just a moment, but I wanted to take a step back and look at the broader question: how might the Armageddon campaign look and what else could come with it? And what has me thinking that this might be a campaign, you ask? Well, in the core book we find 6 war zones, 2 each for the Imperial, Chaos and Xenos factions. Some of these are really interesting, particularly Lavenir, which has seen the Eldari race unite in a fractious alliance in order to save a collection of their maiden worlds from the Maw of Highfleet or Ouroboros. But perhaps more importantly, the Hrud seem to be present in the system, and the consequence of their time-warping abilities becoming part of the Tyranid DNA sequence makes this a conflict of titanic significance for the galaxy. And yet we also see war zones that have already served as campaigns, notably the Pariah Nexus and Vigilus. These were obviously part of very different sagas in 8th edition, but they were campaigns nonetheless, and both served as methods of releasing new models. In fact, both the Vigilus and Pariah sections make a point to stress that these conflicts are still ongoing, and that their respective factions will have to return to finish what they started. But I think this choice of locations is rather interesting, and the fact they've not only made a point of picking out these particular locations, fleshing out their lore, bigging up the conflicts, and just kind of leaving them there as major developments for their respective factions, makes them feel rather like a Chekhov's gun. If they don't end up being used, then there really is no point in having them there, and Games Workshop surely knows that. So let's take it for granted that at some point we will see a new campaign centred on Armageddon. What might we want to see come with it? That's what we'll focus on over the rest of this video. And the obvious suggestion to make is that Armageddon will usher in a new Khorne faction for Warhammer 40k, led by Angron himself. In many ways though, we kind of already know that new World Eaters are coming. There was an interview a while back with Jez Goodwin, Games Workshop Citadel miniatures designer, and the topic of World Eaters came up. Rather than bat it off completely, Jez then decided to say this.
I don't know, quite like World Eaters though.
Good man, yeah, we'll take that. I have to take your first answer.
Yeah, we ought to do some new miniatures for those at some point.
That would be a fine idea. Alright, and well, on that bombshell, we'll have to draw an end to this podcast recording.
Now, I don't know about you, but I really doubt that Jez would have said this if there was nothing to go on. Furthermore, we roughly know that if new core models were coming out in the next year or so, they would have had to be in the early design process during 2018 when this interview was recorded. But even without that tongue-in-cheek comment, there's a rather palpable absence of Khorne and Slaanesh in the new 40k rulebook. If you're a new player, you get to learn about the 4 Chaos Gods and their demonic minions, but once you look at the individual Chaos Legions, you only hear about the Black Legion, Death Guard and Thousand Sons. You even get to see how cool Mortarion and Magnus look on the tabletop, along with their chosen legions, but you won't find any Khorne Berserkers or Emperor's Children on display. And that absence from the photography I feel says volumes about Games Workshop's plans. It's not so much that they're ashamed of the sculpts, they just clearly do not want those models to be visible at the start of 9th edition. I expect that's because those models will soon be replaced with new ones, and Games Workshop doesn't want to create too much of a contrast with the later photography when those factions do finally get re-released. But I think we need to see a whole host of new core models, not just Angron and new Berserkers, but also vehicles and elite units that really capture their theme and playstyle. For example, Thousand Sons and Death Guard have their own Terminator models, so World Eaters I feel should have them too. Equally, in a lot of the artwork we see from the followers of Khorne, there's a great emphasis on their demonic possession and the sacrifice of their mortality for wanton bloodlust. That could literally spawn a whole manner of demon-infused followers and engines for Angron to lead into battle, and will nicely distinguish them from the other legions with their bloated, diseased artillery and warp-powered monsters. Naturally, I can tell I don't need to convince you how great a broader Khorne 8 release might be. It's not just for the sake of filling out the blatant gaps in the lore and Games Workshop's web store, but also bringing a distinctly combat-themed army into an edition that is still largely dominated by gunlines. Shaking up the meta this way, even if Angron and his legion are OP as hell, is something I can live with for a time, and I think many players will be emboldened to try more balanced and combat-themed versions of their own factions if big hitters like this come screaming out of the gate. But one faction does not a campaign make, so I also wanted to dwell on who might counterbalance Angron's forces in the story and in the releases that accompany it. And going off the Inquisitor's frantic message in the rulebook, it seems the Grey Knights are being called on once again to try and deal with this latest incursion. As such, they're probably going to end up right at the heart of the conflict, going toe to toe with Angron personally, and I think that calls for either a new hero model or, and here come the groans, a primarising, even if that is a word, of at least part of the current Grey Knights range. Now, as a Grey Knights player, I am very happy with them not bringing Primaris to the Grey Knights. They don't really match the aesthetic. However, I do wonder if the slow phasing out of standard Marines will leave Grey Knight strike squads in a bit of a weird space narratively and on the tabletop. They're not cheap, and it seems they'll soon be the weakest of the Marines with only 1 wound apiece. Heck, even our Terminators don't feel all that tough right now. I know some people really don't like the Primaris range, and I completely understand why, but I do wonder if there's a way of capturing the broader shift we're seeing in the Space Marines, but in a way that feels authentic to the Grey Knights. Perhaps a unit of unique Primaris Paladins bred for the task of battling Angron, or maybe something less intrusive on the range, a new Brother Captain Stern model for example. Whatever it is, I do hope the Grey Knights get the spotlight for a good chunk of the campaign, with new models to shine in those moments, and that they don't simply become unwelcome bystanders when Angron does finally make his big appearance. Of course, putting Angron and the Grey Knights aside, Armageddon has long been a war zone between the Steel Legion and the Orcs, and I think this is where we're already being teased with new releases. There was a video recently on the Warhammer YouTube channel that hinted at some of the new models coming with 9th edition, and interestingly, they're all from factions that have quite significant roles in the war zones we find in the Core Rulebook. But looking at the Orcs in particular, it seems we're finally getting new Orc boys, or maybe even Orc knobs, but I really do hope it's the former because, as I've said in a previous video, I think boys just feel a little stilted and monotonous when photographed opposite far more dynamic and posable units. What else Orcs might need I'll leave to more veteran players to guess, but I'm somewhat intrigued by one of the passages in the Armageddon section. It talks about an entity hungry and furious for war, ushered by the cracking of bones and endless piles of skulls dripping with blood and molten brass. Those of you versed in Chaos will recognise these as clear references to Khorne, and yet, the passage also refers to the entity as a beast with tusks and a gaping maw. As such, I can't help but feel intrigued by the possibility that this could be Gork and Mork, the deities of the Orcs, who are just as hungry for war and bloodshed as Khorne is. Given this is the Orc homeworld after all, it wouldn't surprise me. On one level, I think this is a deliberate smudging of the two by Games Workshop in order to build suspense, but it's exciting to think that Armageddon might not just be the battleground for one godlike entity, but several. And with that conflict in mind, I wonder if Armageddon could actually see the appearance of Tusker Demon Killer, having been stuck on one of Khorne's demon worlds and forced to fight endless waves of demons for the Blood God's pleasure. I can see Tusker being a perfect champion for this conflict, drawn to the planet not only through the Red Angel's Gate, which Angron will likely pass through himself, but also the growing presence of his own deities. Maybe that's being too greedy on my part, but it's clear that Armageddon has as much significance for the Orcs as any other faction, and I really do hope that, given they have never been more of a threat to the Imperium as they are now, this could be a defining moment for them and a decisive one in their claim for Armageddon. Naturally though, standing in their way will have to be the Steel Legion, and this is where I feel less certain about what to expect. I personally would like to see more love for the individual regiments, and we're starting to see that with the special edition Kachchan models. In fact, it seems Kachchan might just be another major Warzone in 40k soon enough. But will we see new Steel Legion models in an Armageddon campaign? I would hope so, and the Steel Legion's specific focus on armoured companies offers a great basis for one or two new vehicle models. Also, if we look at the map, Semtexia has been entirely cut off to Armageddon, and that system was a major source of artillery for the Imperial forces on the planet, so we may just see what takes their place now that the situation is this dire. But while I'm hopeful for regimental releases in general, I'm also a bit sceptical in this case, and hear me out on this one. What I'm very aware of, and let's close by talking about where I'd expect the story to go, is that Armageddon is in a very dire situation. Even if Angron is defeated, and he won't be, let's be honest, that would be one heck of a letdown. The planet is rife with demonic corruption, plus the Orcs have infested every corner of it, making any sense for an Imperial victory largely hollow. Also, as the book tells us, this is potentially Armageddon's final doom, and I'm not sure there really is any going back from it without a rather underwhelming set of events. With that in mind, I think we're more likely to see any Armageddon campaign result in its end shattered as Angron is spewed out and smashed into the forces of Ghazghkull, the Inquisition and the Steel Legion. That's the sort of moment that does justice to a return to Armageddon, a war worthy of Angron and Ghazghkull's time, and one that also does justice to the Steel Legion, as with Cadia we can watch the planet break long before they do. Maybe I'm getting a bit fanciful, Armageddon may yet survive, but I wonder what you can do with it other than break it at this point. Will it become a demon world? Will Ghazghkull finally conquer it? Those certainly could happen, and maybe they might set the stage for an attempt to recapture it by the Imperium. But having one faction win in any sense also kind of feels a little empty given the stakes and sacrifices that have already been made over the planet's history, not least by Commissar Yarrick, wherever he is right now. Time will tell, but I get the feeling that Armageddon's mention here is not simply another stop on our journey through the 40k galaxy. It seems like an invitation to something with much more impact and a far greater sense of finality. Armageddon is being called out, I sense, because we may never go back again. So that's just a few of my thoughts on why an Armageddon campaign is likely and what may just come with it. Naturally I know as much as you right now, but it's clear we're being teased into something monumental, and whether I'm right or wrong, I can't wait to have my army step onto the soil of this planet once again and to see what it has in store for us. But what do you think might be coming to Armageddon, and what models and rules would you like to see as the focus? Let me know all of that in the comments below and let's have a bit of a discussion about it. But I also want to say thank you for watching this video. Please do take a moment to like it and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and I do hope you'll join me for the next one. But until then, take care.